The funeral of Detective Lucas Morgan extended. It was a gray, dreary afternoon when Detective Lucas Morgan's funeral took place. The somber clouds hanging in the sky cast a muted, melancholic hue over the cemetery, as if the heavens themselves mourned the loss of the dedicated officer. A thin drizzle dampened the crowd, making the air thick and cold, but it did little to deter the mourners who had come to honor Lucas. He had been a force for good in the city, known for his sharp mind and unparalleled dedication to the law. His sudden death had left a void that could never be filled. As family, friends, and colleagues stood under umbrellas, there was one figure who seemed out of place amid the solemnity. Shadow, Lucas's loyal K9 partner, sat silently beside the polished mahogany casket, his dark eyes scanning the crowd and his ears twitching with an odd restlessness. Shadow had been by Lucas's side through countless missions, and though the dog was trained to remain calm and composed, today was different. The bond between Lucas and Shadow had always been deeper than most people could understand. They were more than just a police officer and his dog. They were partners in every sense of the word. The priest's voice was soft but steady as he spoke the traditional words of comfort. But Shadow remained restless. His body trembled slightly, and his tail gave the faintest of wags, as though he was trying to reach out to his handler. Even in death, the officers and mourners, while grieving, couldn't help but notice the unusual behavior of the usually stoic dog. The sharp bark that broke the silence, followed by frantic whines, startled everyone. The dog leaped up from his sitting position, his fur bristling with tension, and turned toward the casket. His eyes locked on it in a way that sent a shiver down the spine of every person present. "Easy, Shadow," one of the officers called out, but his voice lacked the confidence it normally carried. There was a nervousness in the air as the dog began to bark again, more urgently this time. Shadow's eyes were wide with distress, his muscles taut as though he were preparing for an action no one could understand. Shadow, trained for years to withstand chaos and remain level-headed, was not acting like himself. The bark rang out again, loud, insistent, and desperate. His paws were now pounding against the ground, clawing at the casket as though trying to dig into the earth below. "I've never seen him act like this," Sergeant Daniel said, exchanging a look with his colleagues. David, Lucas's older brother, stepped forward, his face pale with disbelief. Yet something inside him told him that this was no mere display of canine anxiety. "Open it," he demanded, his voice cracking with emotion. "Something isn't right. Open it now." The police chief, a man with years of experience, furrowed his brow in hesitation. "David, please," he said gently. "Not now. This isn't the time for theatrics." But David's gut told him something more sinister was at play. His voice grew firmer. "Open it. I have a bad feeling about this." The chief was taken aback by the sudden intensity in David's voice. He had seen grief manifest in many ways, but David's insistence was different. There was something in his eyes that spoke of deep intuition. "All right," the chief sighed, "but be ready for the worst." Two officers approached the casket, their faces tense. With trembling hands, they began to lift the heavy lid. A few seconds passed, and then a collective gasp swept through the crowd. Evelyn, Lucas's mother, let out a guttural scream as she stumbled back, her hand clutching her heart. David's eyes widened in horror, his jaw slack with shock. The body inside was not Lucas. For a split second, everything seemed to stop. Officers drew their weapons, their faces a mix of confusion and fear. No one moved, no one spoke. Shadow had stopped barking, but he remained tense, watching intently. His tail was still, and his gaze never left the casket, as if confirming the truth to those who had yet to realize it. Evelyn collapsed into the arms of one of the officers, her sobs echoing through the cemetery as the other mourners stood frozen, unable to comprehend the shocking turn of events. The police chief barked orders, urging officers to secure the area and ensure that there was no immediate threat. His voice was shaky with the shock of the revelation. "Someone get to the hospital, now," he ordered, his mind racing. The casket had been meant to contain the body of his fallen comrade, Detective Lucas Morgan, but the man in the casket wasn't Lucas, it was Officer Dean Hall. The story that would unfold would send shockwaves through the entire department. No one had expected this. Shadow had been the only one who seemed to understand. The shocking revelation: the entire police force was shaken. The funeral that was meant to honor a fallen officer had instead uncovered a devastating error, one that not only exposed flaws in the system, but also raised questions about the very nature of fate and intuition. How had this mix-up occurred? How had Lucas been declared dead when, in fact, he was still alive, fighting for his life in a hospital bed? As officers rushed to investigate, it became clear that the misidentification of Lucas had happened in the aftermath of the brutal shootout with the gang. Both Lucas and Dean had been critically wounded and rushed to separate hospitals, where confusion reignited during the chaos of the night. Both men had been placed into critical care units, and in the rush of trying to save them, the hospital had mistakenly declared Lucas dead. The most horrifying part of the mistake, however, was the fact that the two officers' identities had been switched. Lucas, though unconscious, had been mistakenly identified as Officer Hall, who had suffered similar injuries at some point during the chaotic night. Hospital staff had inadvertently prepared Dean's body for burial instead of Lucas's. The identification process had been rushed, and in their exhaustion, the hospital workers failed to verify the identities properly. The department's internal affairs began a full investigation into how this mistake had happened. Questions were raised about the procedures in place, how this catastrophic error had slipped through the cracks, and how it had gone undetected for so long. But no one was asking the most important question: how had Shadow known? The canine's behavior during the funeral was far from random. The dog had been with Lucas throughout the entire ordeal, and his bond with the detective had always been something that seemed almost unexplainable. Shadow had never reacted like this before. He had been frantic, desperate, as though he had known that something was terribly wrong. The investigation into the incident was both meticulous and urgent. Hours after the funeral, the police chief dispatched officers to the hospital to confirm the identity of Lucas, who, to their astonishment, was still alive though in a coma and fighting for his life. It was a miracle that Lucas had survived, given the severity of his injuries, but it was clear that without Shadow's insistence, though in a coma and fighting for his life, it was a miracle that Lucas had survived, given the severity of his injuries, but it was clear that without Shadow's insistence, no one would have questioned the casket's contents. Lucas's recovery was nothing short of miraculous. After being pulled from the brink of death, he remained in a coma for 2 weeks, his body battered and broken from the trauma of the gunfight. Doctors were amazed that he had survived at all, but the true miracle came when Lucas finally opened his eyes. The first thing Lucas became aware of was the warm, comforting presence of Shadow by his side. The dog had been there the entire time, watching over him, waiting for the moment when his partner would wake. When Lucas's hand reached out and touched Shadow's thick fur, the dog's tail gave a soft wag, as if to say, "I knew you'd come back." Lucas had heard nothing about the events that had transpired during his coma. He hadn't been told about the funeral, the confusion, or the horrific error that had nearly led to his death. Being falsely confirmed, he was still too weak to fully grasp the gravity of the situation. But as the days passed and he regained strength, the truth began to unfold. He learned that in his absence, the world had mourned his loss. His mother, his colleagues, his brother, none of them had known he was still alive. They had believed him to be gone, and yet it was Shadow, his faithful companion, who had been the only one to recognize that something was wrong. Lucas couldn't comprehend how this could have happened. He couldn't fathom the confusion and heartbreak his family must have endured. But the most pressing thing on his mind was Shadow's unwavering loyalty. The dog had acted out of pure instinct, barking, scratching, and refusing to leave the casket until the truth was revealed. How had Shadow known? As Lucas's body healed, so did his mind. He began to reflect on the deep connection he shared with Shadow. It was a bond that transcended words, a bond that only those who had experienced it could truly understand. Shadow had saved his life, and Lucas knew that he owed everything to his loyal dog. The department's responsive investigation into the identity mix-up quickly turned into an inquiry into how such an oversight could have happened. Within the police department and the hospital, the public and media were abuzz with questions, and the department's reputation was at stake. The police department immediately enacted new protocols to ensure that no officer would ever be misidentified again. Medical staff, too, were reassured that they would undergo additional training and oversight to avoid such a fatal mistake in the future. While the hospital staff acknowledged the grave error, the department knew that it could never undo the pain caused by this mistake. However, the most profound lesson learned from this incident was the role that intuition and loyalty had played. Shadow's behavior at the funeral had been a testament to the strength of his bond with Lucas. His instincts had saved his partner's life, a point that became the focus of many of the department's internal discussions. Despite the chaos, the department's collective respect for Shadow grew tenfold. The K-9 unit had always been an important part of the police force, but now it was clear that the bond between a dog and his handler could sometimes be more valuable than the best investigative tools. The return to duty after months of rehabilitation. Lucas made his return to active duty. His body was no longer the broken shell it had been when he first woke up, but the emotional scars from the ordeal were harder to heal. He struggled with the weight of the mistake that had nearly cost him his life and the lives of those closest to him. Shadow, however, was there every step of the way. The dog had been by Lucas's side throughout the entirety of his recovery, and it seemed that their bond had only grown stronger in the wake of the traumatic events. Together, they re-entered the field, their partnership more unshakable than ever. Lucas's return to work was met with a mixture of awe and relief. It was clear that his time away from the force had been difficult, but the department was overjoyed to have him back. He was ready to resume his work with Shadow, tackling new cases and ensuring that the mistakes of the past were never repeated. The legacy of Shadow Lucas and Shadow continued to serve together. More inseparable than ever, their partnership became legendary, not just in their precinct, but in the larger law enforcement community. They were a symbol of loyalty, perseverance, and the power of instinct that as the years went by, their bond remained unbroken. Together, they solved cases that others couldn't, tackled dangers that seemed insurmountable, and protected their city with unmatched devotion. Lucas would often reflect on the moment when Shadow had saved him not just from physical harm, but from being lost forever in a sea of bureaucratic mistakes. Their partnership had proven that sometimes loyalty and love could uncover the truth when all else failed. Shadow had never needed to speak a word, yet his actions had spoken volumes. His instinct had saved his partner, and that bond, one that transcended the boundaries of human understanding, would be remembered for generations. Their story became a legacy, not just of the remarkable bond between a man and his dog, but of the unwavering loyalty that could be found in the most unlikely of places. Lucas and Shadow's partnership was a reminder to all who heard their story that true loyalty cannot be measured by reason, but by the heart.